So I'm like really excited to get started, and I'm willing for people to wander in afterwards. So you guys have been so patient and waiting, and I have, I mentioned earlier, this is a full day workshop that I'm putting into an hour-long talk because there wasn't anything I could realistically say, oh, they don't need to know more about this. So I have business cards like at each end, definitely, and it's all in the slides and stuff. Email me, I will give you the full slide deck, and love to have conversations with you about all of this. So, I'm gonna turn it on. Yeah, or not. It's not moving now. Like even, isn't that weird? This room has had some tech problems all day, so I think, nope. It's flashing, but not going anywhere. This is crazy, this room. Because you know what's worse than blinking slides is slides that don't advance. Yeah? I've never seen this happen before.
Can we reopen the...
Yeah, go ahead and take it out, and then, doesn't matter. You can hit, yeah, either one is fine, and it's right there. Maybe that's, yeah, Crazy. Let's hope that it just works. That's okay. It's really okay if it does that. I will do the old-fashioned way to get to the browser and all that. Let's just leave it the way it is. All right. So I work at a company called Simply Accessible. Pretty straightforward, I think, what we do. It's all we focus on. We're very focused on inclusive design, development, teaching people how to build accessibility into their process. And so we go as nerdy, geeky, UXy, businessy, marketing, Scrum as you go, pretty much. My name is Elle Waters, and I tweet a lot at Nethermind. And you can reach me, l@simplyaccessible.com. That's kind of a longish Twitter hash name. So I put NDC A11Y in case you do want to like carry on a conversation. I have 3 talks tomorrow on different topics as well. So A11Y is the hashtag that's most commonly used on Twitter for accessibility. Great conversations happening. A little bit like the public plaza, though, so you get weird street fights on topics and things like that, but it's a great thing to be able to know. It's like internationalization, where it has I-18N, A11Y is that there's 11 characters in between A and Y in accessibility. So today, this is what I'm hoping we can get through. We'll see how far we go, and at some point, somebody might raise their hand and cry out for mercy. We'll see. So we have some things we'll go through, basic overview about web-based forms, the building blocks of accessible forms, form fields and labels, because it's kind of the heart, the meat of most forms. Then we'll talk about custom elements, and we have a lot of code samples as well to provide for you guys so that it's not just theoretical. You can actually look under the hood and see how something's being done. Hopefully, this is a very popular topic, Aria. So we will talk a little bit about Aria. We won't go super deep into it because the truth is you don't need to go super deeply into it. There's the thing no one tells you. We'll talk about a couple of complex scenarios, and then we'll just kind of start on validation. And as nerdy as it sounds, if anybody wants to go further and talk more about validation, I'll be at the party tonight, and we can have the geekiest moment ever. So let's do a quick review, because some of you guys may be kind of new to the understanding of what accessibility means. You'll look on Wikipedia, you'll see a definition. Web accessibility refers to the inclusive practice of removing barriers that prevent interaction with or access to websites by people with disabilities. And when sites are correctly designed and developed and edited, all users have equal access to information and functionality. It's super dry, doesn't really tell you how that applies to what you do. Our team basically says that it is for every person, for every device. And it's a pretty aspirational goal, but it's what we do. And so we're always looking to make sure that something is as usable by as many people as possible. So make things work for everyone, regardless of their abilities. So in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, there's 4 principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And in an intro talk, I go pretty deep into examples and what that's like. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory. If you want to talk more about sort of the basics on web accessibility, we can do that. It's important to note that 1 in 7 people have a disability, according to the World Health Organization, and Google published this recently as well on their accessibility page. So from a developer perspective, that is 15% of the world's population versus 3.9% of desktop internet users. This number keeps going down every time I do this particular slide. So when your business stakeholders say that accessibility is not really a must-have because it's for a really small percentage of people, you just tell them, okay, that's fine, I just won't test in Edge or IE of any kind. All right, is that good? Because obviously there's a little bit of a weighting there that makes it worth considering if you have 15% of your customers. Oh my God. So it's not a binary thing. It's not black and white. It's not flipping of a switch. And I know engineers typically really appreciate the clarity of standards, solid code, predictable, test-driven kinds of scenarios. There are pieces like that to accessibility, but because the human factor is a part of it, there's a lot of messiness in that. And there's a lot of it depends out of that. So because of the fact that there's a lot of these different shades of gray, you want to think about that when you're looking at different scenarios and think about testing with real users. So how do you make forms accessible? Let's dive in. All right, assistive technology, which is what some people with disabilities use, is actually designed specifically to work with well-crafted forms. So in a nutshell, that means if you have a shitty form, that form will not work very well with assistive technology, because how would they know what kind of weird magical voodoo that you're doing with your markup? They're going according to something. So who defines what a well-crafted form is? Here's some tips. Use web standards, best practices, and native form elements. Don't be afraid of that. We'll talk about custom elements later. Ensure full keyboard accessibility. Oftentimes with accessibility, people think about people who are blind who use a screen reader. That's usually the first thing, a user group that people go to. But there are many more people who are sighted keyboard users than there are who have mobility impairments than there are people who are blind using a screen reader. Use a visible focus indicator. Either use the browser default or make one better. And use relative sizing for your containers, your elements, your typography, and think in terms of percentages or M's or rims for the 2 here who probably do that. And use elements as they were designed to be used. So again, who defines what something should do and how it should function? So the W3C, Worldwide Web Consortium, basically puts out, here are the specifications. For example, HTML5, which we're huge fans of because it's so much better. You look and you see how something was meant to be used, and you go according to the specifications, and you make that much easier for people with assistive technologies. And like science, web standards exist, whether you choose to believe in them or not. So a lot of times people think of it as sort of a nice to have or an optional thing, but that doesn't change the reality that, again, you build shitty code, and yes, you will have shitty user experiences. So one of the biggest things that we tell people, use Semantic HTML. And the question with that is, what is Semantic HTML? A lot of people use, an IDE, and they're using, say, Visual Studio, and they're dragging and dropping controls. But when you're actually looking at what your page is being built as on the front end, because 90% of accessibility lives in that view layer, you have to ask yourself, okay, what is this thing, and how does it behave? Can anybody tell me, what is this element? A select, yes. And how do you know that? because it's, you know, kind of roughly bar shaped, and it's got these things, right? These affordances, right? A select typically does not function like a set of checkboxes, right? The idea is that you're selecting something. There's multi-select, we understand that, but there's a certain expectation when somebody comes to this element of what they should expect. Like if I click here, what should happen? Yeah, you see a drop-down of choices to make. That's because we've seen it time and time again, and we know that's how it should function. So if you are presenting elements in a form to your users, think in terms of what this element is and what the expectation is of how it should work. So on the counter side of that, I'm a button. Button type, button, I'm a button, right? Pretty straightforward. Or am I? Span class equals button thingy, role equals button, or am I? This does not function very well for people who need something to act like a button. There's a lot that you need to put into this that comes by default with a button element. This is not a real duck. Span ID Woody, class equals duck, role equals fowl, title equals DCUK, quack, right? That's not a real duck. This is not a real tan. Many people would say this is not a real president. Always opt for the real thing first, otherwise you never know what you will get. I hope that sticks with you guys and you really think about that. The second principle, too, to consider is progressive enhancement. It sounds old-fashioned these days. People think it's, you know, it was kind of a moment where everybody was super excited about it. Jeffrey Zeldman, everybody, yes! And then they're like, now it's all about Angular and React and Ember, and everybody's like, whatever. I'm not really thinking about that because I have this new thing. Progressive enhancement still matters. This is a wonderful visual. It's in a Shopify article recently, and I love the fact that we're still talking about it because it still matters. You know, what you're eating are not candles. What you're eating is not frosting. What you're eating is cake. And likewise, with progressive enhancement, you need to think in terms of the base, the majority of what you do, regardless of what technology stack you have. The web is meant to operate from a content perspective, and content and that semantic information is generally contained within the HTML layer. So that should be very, very heavy as far as what your focus is. Then you enhance that with CSS. Then you can enhance that with JavaScript, maybe back and forth interchangeably. And at the very end, when none of these solutions will work, you can look to Aria as a solution, which we'll go into a little more later. If you were to flip this pyramid, like many people do, especially when they're trying to design a web form for accessibility, they put a hell of a lot of Aria in there, then they JavaScript all the things, and they're manipulating the DOM, and they're doing all of these things, and it gets really, really brittle and really fragile, and you're basically shrinking the amount of people that can effectively use your web form. So we tell people when we're talking to engineering teams, solve the problem the lowest in the stack you can. So hopefully this will help make sense. Which of these could you use to programmatically associate a visible label with a text field? That's what you probably should use, right? But you could, again, manipulate the DOM with JavaScript, do a weird injection, make me a label. You could put an Aria label tag on something or Aria labeled by. You could put a fake duck out there, right? And decide to put all that stuff in. But if you're looking at the technology that you're using, the technology stack you're using, the lowest thing in that stack is HTML. That has the most support for the most amount of users and will not break depending on the device and the inputs and the assistive technologies. HTML works. So if it works, use it. The lowest problem, solve the problem the lowest in the stack that you can. HTML is the framework for accessible content. So no matter how crazy you get on your web page, that framework is the thing that holds it all together. Otherwise, bad things happen later on the roller coaster. The second or third thing is that source order actually matters. So I'm going to go through a few principles in a row, and then I'm going to see if this doesn't have weird tech problems. I'm going to show you live what the experience is like for a sighted keyboard user. Source order matters, keyboard accessibility, and provide a visible focus indicator. So here I am at my favorite site to pick on, Amazon. Probably has the largest amount of technical debt of any e-commerce site in the world. And if I assume that I am a sighted keyboard user, it means I don't use a mouse, I don't use a trackpad, I'm going to use only the keyboard to be able to navigate. And by the way, I recommend this book, awesome book, called Radical Candor. And I'm going to basically be browsing and looking at this product. So the first thing I'm going to do, it's pretty common, is I'm trying to tab to that because I'm going from active element to active element. And, you know, maybe I'm going somewhere. I think I see it every once in a while, but you can tell that I'm kind of like very tiny bits of visible focus, like something becomes underlined. Something has a little bit of a dotted focus ring. And yet, after that, I don't know where I've gone, right? Here I'm back to orders, prime, cart. Now I don't know where I am again. So we have this thing, and again, either send me a tweet or email me, and I'll give it to you. It's not an accessibility tool, it's an accessibility testing tool. If our testers were looking at this, they would stop, because they really wouldn't know how much was effectively being used because they can't see the focus outline on things. So we have this bookmarklet called Show Tab Focus. And basically for that page, it puts this big red box around whatever has the focus. So now you can see it's on the search bar. Now I'm on this. I'm going through here. And this tells me really what the tab order is, and I go through it and I say, okay, again, I'm sure it's going to some hidden menu. And then you're kind of looking, don't judge that I have 12 things in my cart. I'm a cart parker with Amazon all the time. So now I'm looking at this second menu, and I'm going through this, and then now I'm not really sure where I've gone. If you see where the focus is, let me know, because it's a little hard at this angle. Yeah? Yeah. So weird, right? Because it's not going, typically source order should go top to bottom, left to right on Western pages. And so I'm here, and imagine what this experience is like, not just from a sighted keyboard user, even though, yes, this is a pretty terrible experience. When somebody is using a screen reader, they're basically consuming content in a very linear way. So they're at this point, they're saying, okay, Radical Candor and over 1 other million books available, Amazon Kindle, learn more. Then I'm in the share section, and then the next thing is I'm in the buy. I haven't gotten to a title, I haven't gotten to an image, I haven't gotten to anything that tells me that I'm actually on the right page and it's asking me to buy it. So when we're talking about source order matters, this is one of the main reasons why it matters. Another is people who are sighted keyboard users sometimes are that way because of a physical disability that causes them a lot of mental pain and exhaustion and physical exhaustion. And so what you're doing is you're putting this huge amount of cognitive load and perhaps even more physical pain onto somebody just because they have to sit there and work 3 or 4 or 5 times as hard to be able to get to that. So again, I go through this, and sometimes this happens with modal dialogues, and you don't have to raise your hand because there's no judgment. This is a judgment-free zone. But people put modal dialogues as an afterthought, and they'll put it at the bottom of the source order, and then they'll just, make it display when it comes up. But that content is adjacent, should be adjacent in the source order, because otherwise you're asking maybe somebody to go all the way to the bottom of the page and then find their way back to where they were. So, where were we? Okay, provide a visible focus indicator. Now you can see there's a real benefit to that, because basically a sighted keyboard user can't get through a page if they don't know where the focus is gone. It's helpful, again, when you're testing for keyboard accessibility. So we'll go past that. Be flexible. So I love responsive web design, not just because it's cool. And not just because now I don't need to wear my glasses when I'm looking at my mobile phone anymore because they aren't doing these tiny little pages, but because of the fact that it ushered in the need for people to think about flexibility. And so a lot of times people are looking at designing for multiple viewports and they understand the need to have things flexible. But to go a little deeper with accessibility, you need to think in terms of container height and width. Sometimes people just think in terms of height. Think about both of those. Here's some examples. This is Ryan Airways. Airlines are great too when you want to find a lot of accessibility problems. We work with some, and it's like the most, airlines and banks are like super anxious experiences for people. And so what we definitely see are these problems magnified for people with disabilities. So a lot of times people with disabilities will have a need to enlarge the text, and the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines requires that you not just use like Control plus, Command plus to be able to zoom the entire page, because that creates a scrolling experience. And sometimes people don't want to be in a mobile viewport, so sometimes it'll flip to that if it's a responsive site. And so people will enlarge just the text. And so this is something, there's a really good add-on with Firefox and with Safari that you can use where you can just select to zoom in only on the text. This is at 200%, which is it's the requirement, but it's pretty much a minimum. And you can see that a lot of stuff starts getting cut off and confusing for people. But where it really starts to affect it is if I open up that date picker and I see that they tried to put a visible focus outline, but hell if I know which one of those actually has the focus, right? That's crazy because there's no way for me to know, is that January 16th, is that January 23rd? Don't know. And that's all because of the fact that they weren't designing with flexibility in mind. So, building blocks of accessible forms. Back to this, we'll look at HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and Aria. This is the most amount of bullets of any slides that I've ever put together because there's a lot of small, finite details, and I thought it would be really useful to kind of like empower you guys with this information. So from an HTML perspective, some of this is a little bit of a recap. Choose the best element for the job. Use a native element before reaching for something fancy. Leverage Semantic HTML to communicate under the hood to assistive technology. So assistive technology, again, is looking for, if it's a radio button, I shouldn't be able to select more than one, right? If it looks like a radio button and it's actually a fancy way of doing checkboxes, then we can have a different conversation with your designers. Oh, wait. Let me go back to HTML, almost finished. Provide clear instructional text. This is important. I have an example. I was going to look at taking a walking tour of Oxford this weekend, and I found an awesome, awful example to share with you guys. And use a button to submit your web forms. No need to reinvent something that already exists. CSS, do not disable the default browser ring unless you replace it with something much better. The default browser ring is pretty bad as far as really it's this little tiny dotted line. It doesn't maybe meet your brand standards. It looks different in different browsers, and a lot of UX people don't like that. So then encourage them to be able to design for the focus state. And in that, think in terms of focus states and hover states. And whenever you are typing hover, also think in terms of focus. Because what you're really saying is something has on focus a particular kind of visual treatment, not just on hover. Again, I love the fact that mobile is, we're in that mobile moment because this is something that people have already started to struggle with, knowing that there really is no hover experience on a mobile. JavaScript. Use JavaScript to add accessibility to an interface. If anybody tells you JavaScript is bad for accessibility, then they write bad JavaScript. That's the truth, or they don't know. JavaScript can be really, really useful in enhancing the user experience. The biggest challenge that we see working with dozens and dozens and dozens of clients is that, especially, we can talk a little bit too about Angular in this, people don't manage the focus, and they don't really have an intentional focus path. That doesn't mean, and please God, don't put positive integers on your tab index and tab index all the things, right? Because the next developer who comes along will seek you out with like missiles because they have to maintain all of that. Don't put positive integers on that, but be really intentional about what something's happening. Normally, the focus should just follow the natural tab order, which should be the source order. But those times when you have to programmatically do something and you're putting tab index equals 0 or tab index equals -1, be really intentional. Know not only does it go somewhere, but know where it goes when, say, that modal dialog closes. Really understand how to manage that focus. Toggle important values dynamically based on events. So if something is selected versus not selected, we really like putting visually hidden text that mimics what you see visually. So if something becomes bright blue on a tab and then you switch to the other one, make sure that you're using JavaScript to change the value of that hidden text, because otherwise it'll always say selected. Custom controls. Add all of the expected keyboard usability, name, state, role, and behavior. You have a lot of work to do if you have a custom control, and you're only going to use that custom control. I have a really good code sample from one of our team members that will show you how to layer things, because yay, we're at that point now. And manage Aria state, and we'll talk through that in a bit too. Aria. Use Aria, accessible, rich internet application, only when HTML, CSS, and JavaScript really can't do the job. So really investigate it and think in those terms of progressive enhancement. Manage your Aria state and test, test, test. Most of the time we see Aria, it's poorly implemented, and it's a little bit like primary school children running around with jackknives, like swinging things, because they mean well, but what they actually do sometimes is make an interface less accessible for people with screen readers, because they've over-engineered a solution and they didn't test to actually see what happened. Learn about Aria before using it and test with real users. So this is a great quote that I love from Kevin Bonnet, and I think this was on Stack Overflow. For me as a web developer, semantic HTML must always be the starting point. In my humble opinion, there's no excuse at all for churning out only nested divs with JavaScript event handlers and inappropriate Aria roles. I couldn't have said that better, but now you'll see why he's saying that, because there's all these things that can create a more accessible form experience before you ever have to get to retrofitting your divs with all the things that HTML comes for free. So form, field, and labels. I'm going a little bit of a clip, trying to make sure we get through everything. So in your fields, every visible form field gets a label. And by that, we don't mean just, first name out there, but that it's for an ID programmatically associated. Use HTML5. We love HTML5 for native input fields, and then style them as you want to. HTML5 has some real benefits for forms for accessibility, so highly encouraged. Design and implement native file upload field buttons. That's really something, a lot of times people try and get super fancy with that. And here's one that's a little bit contentious, and if designers push back on this, I'd love to have more conversation. Avoid read-only and disabled fields, because there is really spotty support for assistive technology, and what you may hear in one screen reader, you won't hear the same in another screen reader. Additionally, there's some real problems with disabled fields for people who have low vision, because by necessity, they have to look different visually, and they're usually pretty low contrast. So that becomes a very difficult proposition to be able to have that. And from usability testing, not just with people with disabilities, but people without disabilities, they get very confused about what is the state, why is it disabled, what do I need to do, and it puts somebody on this sort of scavenger hunt to figure out how to enable the button. And instead, rely on validation. Create really solid, great forms, and expect that error message to help people through the process if they don't do it correctly. That's a much better user experience, believe it or not, than read-only or disabled fields. I don't hear anybody in an uproar over that, so that's good. All right, labels. Each label's text should have sufficient contrast. That's kind of what we were talking about before. Each label should be unique. That's pretty 101. A lot of times we'll teach these things to development teams, and they'll say, well, this is just like, doing your job well. We're like, yeah, it kind of is. Each label should have text that's large enough and easy to read. Again, this is usually a design-related thing, but it plays out in a lot of different ways. Don't use placeholder attributes instead of labels. If you really must do something because your design team has decided that they're going to ignore the years of usability testing feedback that says that placeholders are confusing for people and they'll skip right over them, And it's possible people are starting to understand placeholder labels, and maybe the 70-year-olds who are struggling with them are not the 20-year-olds who use your application. That's fair. Use a label, and you've seen this pattern out there before where you have floating labels where they start looking like a placeholder and then they kind of float up to the top. That's great, because the biggest problem, even beyond the color contrast of that or the confusion that it's already been filled in, the biggest problem is that placeholders aren't generally persistent. Otherwise, you couldn't fill in the field, right? And that if that is the only visual indicator of what that field means and it disappears, that's incredibly confusing. And so you end up triggering this situation where people have to go out of the field and back into it just to be able to remember what it was they needed to fill in. So the floating label idea is a really good way to kind of solve for that and meet everyone's needs on real estate and things like that. Provide a clear indication of what fields are required. Generally speaking, people use an asterisk. We recommend, if you want to just really turbocharge your experience, use a foreground image sprite, use an asterisk image, and use the alt text required on it, and that way people actually know. We're not yet at a point, believe it or not, where people in all parts of the world who use web forms understand that an asterisk means required. And for screen readers, sometimes it does read out star, star, star. Could be confusing for people. Provide clear instructional text and consider visual proximity of labels from form elements. And if I have time tomorrow, if you guys want to know, or there's videos online of us, we have this thing called the straw test that we do, where you're basically mimicking a low vision user and trying to understand how to fill out a form. And when everything is far, far apart, it's very difficult for people who have the screen zoomed in to really high magnification. They may never see that submit button, for example. So consider grouping things together visually in proximity for one another. So this is my walking tours of Oxford experience. And so I was looking at this page and I came across this. And I'm really not sure what to do with that. Like, it was a good attempt. They're trying very hard to, give me something that's persistent, tell me the information, here's the format, but I have no idea which one I'm supposed to use. And then additionally, if you go back to this, there's a button, or when I mouse over here, there's like a button right here. And I don't really know what that does. And so I clicked on it, and of course it brings up a date picker. And I thought, okay, I guess this is always people trying to engineer solutions without realizing that that's just impossible for people to understand. Don't do this, please. So let's talk a little bit about custom elements. It's really something people love to do. And we really kind of struggled with it because custom elements require a hell of a lot of work to build in all the things that come with native elements. With that said, custom form elements are really introducing barriers because it's an idea that the design is more important than the function. And that's the truth. And this becomes, again, those awkward conversations with designers who want really beautiful stylized checkboxes, and they're not okay with the kind of checkbox that, comes out of the box. Oh, that's kind of a pun. So, what if our designers say that this is ugly? This is terrible. Hooray, we live in a new wonderful world. So there are custom looks for your native form fields now. So I have a code pen from one of my team members, and he shows that basically you're taking a native element and with a little bit of wizardry back and forth, you're able to style it in such a way where it can look however they choose for it to look, your designers. So if you go to sateach.es/custom-form-field, you can see it. It's a really good example, and you'll be able to take it where you want. So people interact with the native control. A screen reader user would interact with the native control, which is not visible. And you're basically visually hiding, but making it available to screen readers. We do this a lot with things like infographics and charts. Tomorrow I'll be talking about that, where it's this super, super sophisticated looking infographic, and the best way to be able to make that accessible to the most amount of people would be able to have them able to toggle between a table format, like a data table, or the pie chart that you've just designed. If that's not something people want, then you put that data table in the background. You basically code it, and then you make sure that it's visually hidden. so that the people who need the pie chart will see the pie chart. People who are using the source code, then you're hiding the pie chart from them, and they're using the data table. It is wizardry. So Aria, yay, Aria. The first rule of Aria is don't use Aria. More often than not, say 90%, that's a fake statistic, 90% of the time, people are using Aria because they don't understand how to use markup, CSS, and JavaScript. And that there really is a solution, and it's a more accessible solution. There are some specific use cases that make sense to use Aria. So for those of you guys, raise your hand if you've heard of Aria before, perhaps. So maybe a little over half of you. So Aria was put out as sort of a bridge specification. The idea is that there were a lot of things that were coming out in design that were being coded that didn't have native HTML things like tabs. You know, there's no tab element in HTML4, for example. And so because of that, Aria was meant to be able to provide more information about what this particular object was and what it was meant to do. Especially the more dynamic things got, the more people started to lean on Aria. HTML5 has a lot of the stuff that Aria 1.1 has, and that's one of the reasons why you don't usually need Aria. If you do and must use Aria, then we ask that you're judicious in your use of it. Think in terms of that progressive enhancement. And we say be polite, not just because my company is a Canadian company, but because there's such a thing as an Aria live region, and polite is something that's much better than one that they used to call rude, that is now assertive. So, again, reminding you of the stack, a little bit of Aria is all right. So here's the 4 major use cases for using Aria. Aria Hidden is used for content that shouldn't be available to screen reader users, but should be visible to sighted users. One of the best examples is the one that I was sharing before. Say you have an SVG chart. That chart, besides the fact, again, tomorrow we'll talk about SVG, hella complicated, very difficult to be able to make sure it's fully accessible. One of the best ways to ensure that it's fully accessible for screen reader users is that they never encounter it. Now, more modern screen readers will interpret Aria, but you do have to consider your user base. So if you have people who are using old versions of Internet Explorer, and you can see that through your browser statistics, more than likely they're using old versions of screen readers. So again, there's other ways lower in the stack that you can use Aria Hidden, that you can use instead of Aria Hidden. But this is a really good use case for it when you need to hide something from a screen reader user because it's just not something that they should be interacting with, and you've created the accessible HTML version behind it, like a data table. There are cases where you can provide labeling for fields with complex label and field relationships. So here's 2 scenarios for that. One is somebody's told you to make the web forms that you have, these legacy forms, accessible. Maybe you are a part of the EU directive, perhaps, or you're in America and you have a Section 508 compliance requirement, or you work for an airline. There's lots of laws and regulations that say, I don't care what your release plan is for your new application, this needs to happen right now. So for remediating things, this is a very effective thing because Aria doesn't affect the existing markup, and as a result of that, you have less regression testing. You're not having to redesign the whole experience. So this is a good use case for that. Another one is Aria Live announcements for on-screen updates that screen reader users can't see but are apparent to sighted users. So a good scenario for that would be like you have a shopping cart, and on this side, it's dynamically updating, say, all of my Amazon purchases. And I see this as a visual sighted user. I'm able to see that it's, becoming more than the price of a small card. I need to maybe hold back a little. And yet somebody who's using a screen reader isn't going to have that if their cursor and their focus is on something else. So again, Aria Live has a polite function, and it waits until the screen reader has read out that content that they're on, and then it will tell them the dynamically updated content. And then, of course, things you absolutely can't do with HTML, CSS, JavaScript alone, and it affects screen reader users. So occasionally, occasionally it will affect people who use speech recognition, voice recognition software, Dragon Naturally Speaking. Even though it's a productivity tool, its most recent version has come out with some limited Aria support. So if you get pretty complex into that, there's a lot of decisions that you need to make. That's why we said be judicious. So Aria hidden, when content may cause issues or duplication for screen reader users, has a screen reader friendly text equivalent, then it's safe to use Aria hidden. And so what we generally do is we create a class in CSS, it's called visually hidden, and that hides content. And then we also, again, SVG is a great use case for it, and also Aria hidden equals true. Don't use this if you don't have a text equivalent, because then you're basically blocking a screen reader user from getting anything. And don't use it for things that receive focus, because if it receives focus, somebody will have their cursor go there, and then they won't be able to understand what's happened. So this is a little code snippet for you to be able to use. Again, we'll ship all this out. And if you look at it, we can see this is a situation where we would have recommended, if this were being built from scratch, better techniques. But let's assume that you needed to remediate this because there were no labels here and there were some problems here. And sometimes, will read out as millimeter for some screen reader users. So here's an example. Label for birth month, email, span, Aria hidden equals true. Span / visually hidden. Date of birth, month required. Format, month. Let's assume that was something you wanted to do. That gives them the same information that a sighted user has. And it doesn't have them need to be able to look at as the label for that. Aria label. This is an explicit relationship. This is a one-to-one programmatic relationship. And it may override the label element. We generally don't recommend this. Like, you'd have to present a really good case as to why to use Aria label instead of a label element. The thing that's really useful that we prefer is to use an actual label element and then just use that same CSS class to visually hide it. It's accessible to more people because people may have older technology and they don't have Aria support on their computer, and this allows for it. But if you decided this is the way that you wanted to do it, then here's some examples on how to do that. Advanced Aria labeling. When people don't really think in terms of the information hierarchy, then they presented you with a load of this. So oftentimes really complex tables have these one-to-many relationships, and it's very difficult when you're just trying to put the markup together and you say, here's a label, but it has to apply to these 3 different fields, right? So Aria labeled by has the ability to be able to have a one-to-many relationship. That's the difference, one of the key differences between Aria labeled by and Aria label. Aria label is generally not visually shown. Aria labeled by is usually referring to something that is already visually on the page somewhere. Does that make sense? Kind of. So again, we're looking at office number, the THID is Cindy, and so we need to be able to say, okay, for phone, office number and phone, we need to be able to make sure people understand that that's about Cindy. So Aria labeled by, Cindy, office num. Aria described by recently had some problems with Safari support. Now it's a little better. It used to pause. This is my favorite Aria tag. There's a nerdy statement. My favorite because those required formatting pieces of information are not usually in the tab order. And so because you're not going to put tab index equals 0 on like every piece of content in a form, you might, but it's really not something you need to do. So in order to make sure that people who have screen readers and they're reading the page aloud through their screen reader, they're doing it, like we said, in a linear way, and your designer has said this content that's required format needs to go visually below the field, and we don't like the focus ring coming onto it, so we don't want you to put tab index equals 0. This is a way to programmatically associate content with something else. And so it's really useful because you can look at it and we'll say, okay, it's good for error messaging. Password must be at least 8 characters. And you're able to say, okay, I'm going to put the field focus, I'm going to put the focus here when it's a single error because that's where the focus should go. But maybe there's information about the formatting or whatever, and you want to be able to programmatically associate that. So maybe reset password is a label. This information could be put inside the label and then styled to look like this. Or you can use Aria describe by, which again, big fan. Here's the code sample. Aria Live, my second favorite. So when information should be announced to users but not receive focus. So that's an important consideration. Again, this is about anything that's a live update. If you have a modal dialogue, you should move the focus to that modal dialogue because that's interrupted the user's task flow. But again, if you have a shopping cart and you're adding up things and say you're buying a ticket, a plane ticket, and you'll see on the side as that information is updated, all of that is useful information, but it shouldn't interrupt the flow of what the user's doing. So this is really helpful. Again, we usually also put visually hidden because we don't want that information to show up. Aria Live Polite, role equals status, search results updated, for example. Don't use this for content, like I just said, where it needs to be told this has focus. Otherwise, people won't understand. So that's a good example. Showing one of three, that's an example. We use Aria Live a lot for Aria Live quite a bit for autocomplete features. Again, we have an autocomplete feature too that if you guys want to look at one, that's a really, really complex kind of interaction. This is, I think, helpful for you guys to just keep in mind because some things override other things. And so this is sort of the order of operations when it comes to how screen readers interpret Aria, specifically Aria label by, Aria label, and Aria describe by. Pop quiz. Assistive technologies like screen readers require that Aria be used to convey semantic information to users. True or false? It's a trick question. It's mean, especially at the end of the day. I'm standing between you and a lot of pints, right, at the party. Usually false, right? Usually HTML can do the job, but it depends because in some cases that semantic information does need to be conveyed and Aria is the right way to be able to do that in those limited use cases. So complex scenarios, how am I doing on time? I've got time, yay. Complex scenarios, grouped form fields, right? Date of birth, day, month, year. Especially when it comes to validation, this becomes very complicated because you're like, am I throwing all this into an error? Where does the focus go? What really needs to be the label here? So don't use field sets and legends. Again, controversial, waiting for people to come up in arms. This actually creates a huge amount of verbosity for screen reader users. It doesn't matter how you style it. The truth is, headings if you have a focusable heading, so this is one case where you would want to put, say, tab index equals 0 and use those headings, provides tremendous semantic information for people, and they don't have to hear it, because if you have a field set with a legend, that means that that legend will read aloud every single form field within that field set. And sometimes people will do it for like required format. So it would be like date of birth, MMMM, DD, YYYY, or MMDD, etc. And there'll be like day, DD, and it just keeps repeating. And that's really difficult when you think that somebody is listening to your page. You want to give them the most concise, easy, intuitive, and fast way to be able to complete a form, and that's adding extra. Each field should still have its own label. So how do we do this? Yay. So we're looking at this, and you see that it has, in this case, this is a simple way. Again, no Aria was used in the creation of this form. So you have a heading, tab index equals 0, date label, then you have a label day, ID day, label for month, ID month, label for year, ID year. Simple, easy, won't break, no matter what browser somebody is using for this. It's not going to look weird. It's really just standard. Multi-step forms. So again, code sample for you guys to take a look at. I think that's a code pen. Yeah. And so again, we like to use things like visually hidden because this is adding that extra information, current step, for example, right? Because visually you're conveying, hey, that's got like a really cool looking ring around it, et cetera. And it's, you know, we also put this up in the title of the page as well, updating it as somebody goes through. So we recommend breaking long, complex forms into chunks. That's pretty much a user experience best practice. At this point, people are much it's much easier for them to go through several pages that are digestible than you're at the top of 500 form elements. So unless you work for a government organization, in which case we should talk because I have empathy for you, it's really something you can design for. Visually and programmatically indicate the progress of the form. So I can tell visually what step I'm on, so programmatically I should also be able to know. Again, that visually hidden text, you know, current step, colon, step 1 account information. That's really helpful. Then you go to step 2, and it would be current step, company information. Include steps in the page title, I'll mention that. The other thing to keep in mind is think in terms of your heading structure. That's really important. 60% of the time, people, and that is a real statistic, people who are navigating a page for the first time with a screen reader do it by using headings. They're not doing it by using skip to main content because they don't know where that's going to land them. They don't really understand what your page, how it's structured. And so they use headings because they have really cool shortcuts that I wish we all had. Opera used to have this, but the idea is they can get a list of headings, like a table of contents, and it's really helpful for them. So really beef up your forms, thinking in terms of the heading structure as well. Allow users the ability to go forward and back in the process. Another thing that's common with people using screen readers and people who have cognitive disabilities is they will navigate back and forth to understand kind of the context and the lay of the land, what's expected of them before they ever fill out a form, or they may need to go back and check something. So give people the ability to go back and forth in a process before they submit. Manage the focus between the steps. We've talked about that so that it's not lost or stays on now hidden content. So if you have a page carousel and it's an image slider that's going through, make sure that that focus doesn't actually linger on the things that are now not visible on the page, because then you've basically got something far off that has focus and people can't even tell where they're at. Include form validation for each step instead of waiting for the end of the form. Big fans of client-side validation. That's kind of obvious. In the usability testing talk I do tomorrow, we talk about R.L. Balkin talked about premature inline validation, a problem that many people seem to have. And it's, you know, it is really one of the bigger problems that people have when they're on a field and we think client-side validation is great after it's leaving focus, not before they've started typing anything in. Here's another way to be able to approach the same problem. Use text fields as an alternative to complex form input. So if you're having difficulty with this slider, oftentimes people have difficulty with date pickers, especially because no two are the same, even on the same website at times. We really recommend that you give these text inputs to people as a fallback. Sometimes people just prefer that, but it allows them not to have to figure out how to slide something to exactly 144. They can just type it in, right? So again, examples for both of those. Basic validation. All right, we'll talk a little bit about validation, then I think I have a couple more minutes for questions and discussion. Help your users succeed. There is a research project that people found that people who have an error on a page and they recover from it well have more brand loyalty than people who've never experienced an error on a form on that company's site, which I found really interesting because it's about the willingness and the absolute care that you take with your customers and your users, that you want to be in this with them and help them succeed. Errors happen. So validation on forms provides timely, helpful feedback to help users complete all form fields in the right format. Here's some basic validation best practices. Error message proximity is near the form field. Absolutely. Validation messages should have sufficient color contrast. So if you're picking a red, make sure that that red really has enough contrast. I can give you the statistics or the numbers for that. Error message text should be easy to understand. One thing to keep in mind with error message text, this is required, probably not super helpful, versus first name is required, more helpful. It's more specific. Avoid HTML5-based error validation due to inconsistent assistive technology support right now. That should probably change soon, but for now, we say you should probably avoid it. So if you have multiple errors on a page, we recommend an error summary bucket, basically. And so you're basically creating the error at the field level and then also grouping it together at the top. I have a good example that's been tested in lots of different ways through usability and with some of our clients, and it works really, really well. Send focus if you have an error summary, send it to that error summary. So here's an example. This has an extra little thing in case you want to do it, but that's not necessary. So this is really helpful for a lot of reasons. We've changed the page title, let's say, to the following 3 errors require your attention. And this is a heading, the following 3 items require your attention. This is a foreground image sprite that has probably the alt text is something like error. It's a bulleted list, so that means you're creating semantic HTML and that somebody who's using a screen reader knows that there's 3 things that they can expect in that list. If they didn't get it from the text, they'll get it from the semantic UL of that. Please provide a first name. This is super simple and straightforward to understand what the problem was, and there's an on-page anchor link to be able to set somebody right there in that field. You can't have a date of birth in the future. That's pretty straightforward, right? Error messaging. Skip to the next item using the down arrow. This is kind of an optional thing. We found with a lot of people, we were testing with people with cerebral palsy, and we found that it's very difficult for somebody if they have a relatively long form and they have an error on, say, the first field and an error on the 27th field, that you're basically asking them to tab all the way through that. So one of the things that we found is if they filled this out, fix the next error, last name, they select that, it brings them down to the next thing that's an error. Super helpful. That's not required. These other things are much more fundamental. So again, there's a link for it. You can take a look at it, break it open, look at it, look at the HTML for it. I have a guide to creating forms for Angular that are accessible, and I would love to send it to you guys. I also have a guide to creating accessible maps, which is technically like a whole lot of form elements. Love to send it to you. I also have a ton of other free stuff that's just like, guides that we've created that we think help people and we want you to succeed. So please, definitely email me. I'd be happy to share that stuff with you. This is a relatively nerdy talk, but I'm in a group of nerds, so I figure that's good. And want to know, any questions? So, yes. What's that?
The last slide with the error information you had there, which was good as...
the order of...
No, the next one.
For the errors?
Yeah.
This one.
You wouldn't provide that from the beginning of the site when you go into that page, right?
This is if an error has been caused on the page. So this is before, is that what you're asking? This is if I tried to fill out this form, I can go to the page itself. If I try to fill out this form and it triggers an error because I've submitted it and I had 3 things that I didn't fill out or 2 things I didn't fill out, 1 thing I put like a date of birth in the future. This is upon the page refresh. The focus would go here. And this is a heading that's dynamically, populating all that stuff. Is that what your question was?
Yeah, you're trying to fill out the form first, and then it will show
right,
up,
and this is just the error messaging.
Yeah, okay.
In the interest of time, I probably should have put the first form page into what it looks like, but in the interest of time, this is just the error state of what it looks like afterwards.
Okay.
Any other questions? Oh, God, these lights.
Yes, I think it was very interesting, and it said about field sets and legends that we should never use them with forms.
Yes.
Is that like a general case with every other elements as well? For example, a table, would that cause
problems?
No,
tables, use tables. For tabular data, use tables.
In a legend and field sets.
Oh, I thought you were saying, should we just throw out all the markup? I'm like, no. Generally speaking, you don't need a field set and legend with a table. What you're trying to do is make sure you have headers and IDs, and it depends on how complex your table is. Aim for simpler tables, but generally the table headers are the things that help people understand how to programmatically associate the fields with one another. I had an example of a table that I think has the markup that's needed for that. It was showing something else, but let me see if I can find it. Is that the table? No. I'm going to try and find it really quick. I'm trying to remember what we were using it for. But just basically with a, nope, that's a div. I had a table in here somewhere, I'm trying to find it. There we go. So you see how it has TH, right? That's what's needed to be able to make data tables accessible, is be able to define these things. You wouldn't need to put a field set or a legend around this because it's all one element, a table is, right? And it's got the pieces inside of it. Does that answer your question? Kind of?
Yeah, partly.
Okay.
But I was kind of wondering with field sets and legends in general, because we have one example where we have
like a mailing address?
No, it's like a panel on a page, and it looks very nice to have like separate by this line around with the title, and then. So
a field set and legend are HTML, so they're conveying semantic information, but what you're describing to me sounds like a visual treatment. Is it not?
Yeah, maybe.
So I would say CSS is your friend because you can create the same look with CSS, and it doesn't convey this is a field set, here's the legend, that kind of thing. You want to stick with HTML for the meaning, CSS for the look and feel on that. So.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Other questions, arguments? Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
Validation should be triggered by focus out or during the typing?
It's not during the typing. It should be when the focus leaves, because during the typing is when people get that kind of feedback and they're like, I haven't, like, a good example is Twitter, which I love, obviously. If you're signing up for an account and you start typing your name that you want, before you've finished, it starts throwing it into an error state. And like I said, Arl Bakken called that, I think it was in 2009, premature inline validation. And it's a very funny blog post, but it's basically giving somebody a problem before they've even caused the problem. And you don't actually know until you've left the field that it's actually a problem. Like, not really, right? And usually it's just a programmatic thing, right? You just make sure that when it leaves the focus, then you get that error message. Otherwise, it leaves that field, because otherwise you're throwing an error state when somebody's just now starting to use something. Now, you might have something like when you have password strength and that kind of stuff, there's some states where you're partway through and you already know it's wrong. And we could talk about that on a case-by-case basis, but generally speaking, you don't want to have errors caused unless you're sure that it's an error. Any other questions? Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
Actually all the time, we use Bootstrap, and
Yep.
I'd like to know what your opinion is on the user experience with Bootstrap. Is it adequate enough? Should we do extra or not?
The short answer is yes and yes. Bootstrap has some great accessibility built into it for the less complex things. When you get into the more dynamic JavaScript, heavy, custom-y, widgety looking kinds of things, that's where it starts to fail. And so I would say for the basic semantic structure, for the things that you're looking to do from those first couple of layers of the technology stack, great. But when you're looking at doing things that are, say, really JavaScript heavy, I would look at first jQuery UI, because it seems out of fashion these days, but they have some really solid accessibility built into it.
So, for example, if you were to use like the carousel or the accordion function, you would use Bootstrap only for the HTML and jQuery UI for the JavaScript.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I don't know where the state is of carousels for jQuery UI, but I know we have an example. So ping me, and I'll send you the example, because I haven't looked recently at what library it's using. But for the most part, if I had to pick just one JavaScript library to be able to help me with things, it would be jQuery UI. Because, like I said, they put a lot of work into it.
Hi.
Hi.
A real pet hate of mine is when you get to a website and just as you've started reading, then you get this sign up for our newsletter
Yes.
interrupting your flow
Yes.
as a non-disabled user.
Yes.
What's that experience like with assistive technology?
Usually about 10 times as bad, but well, that's usually the case, right? So for most things, like what is a usability problem for somebody without a disability ends up becoming an accessibility problem for someone with a disability. Now, with that said, you know, those awful pop-ups and stuff like that, they may not actually get focus, and so a person with a screen reader may not even know that it's on the page.
So they might get a better experience.
They might get a
'cause it's
better
not
experience.
announcing that it's
But the
there.
same website is probably going to have a modal that has that dimmed out screen, and they won't set the focus and trap the focus in the modal. And so somebody will be like cruising around on the parent page that's blacked out, and they won't understand why they can't move forward. So it's like kind of a, you know, like a double-edged sword. I mean, I think it's awful. I also think, I tried for years to push back on one client that had like on page load, a modal show up. And they were like, we'll set focus to it. I'm like, still a crappy experience, right? Still terrible. And so I was saying basically, and I think we've got a little bit of justification now after doing some usability testing, that it interrupts that person's expectations. And that's a big thing for accessibility, is that people need to know what's about to happen. And the idea that they're going to this sign-up thing, thinking they're going to a home page, is enough to where our team would probably flag it as an accessibility issue. So maybe we'll fight the good fight together and we'll get rid of those. We'll see. Anything else? Thank you so much for spending the end of your day with me. I really appreciate it. And see you at the party or at PubConf or tomorrow. I have 3 talks tomorrow too in some workshop room. I don't know where it is yet. So thanks guys, and email me.